In our previous session, we started looking at the fourth birth pang out of the nine, and the fourth birth pang is what is referred to as the Magog invasion. So we started talking about this topic in our last session. We talked about how Magog is a country or place, and Gog is the title for the ruler of that nation. Based on the names that are used in scripture, Dr. Fruchtenbaum believes that this invasion, Magog, is a reference to Russia. There's references to some old names for some cities in Russia like Meshech and Tubal, which are, he says, references to places like Moscow and Tobolsk, which are even today cities in Russia. It's talked about this being an invasion from the north. So it's worth noting that Moscow is, in fact, almost directly north of Jerusalem today. Now, even though this is called an invasion from the north, Gog-Magog invasion, this is actually an alliance between Magog and a bunch of other nations. And again, the biblical names for some of these places are really references to current day nations like Iran, Armenia, Ethiopia, and Germany. Now, one thing Dr. Fruchtenbaum points out about all of these nations that are going to be involved in this invasion is that they are mostly Muslim countries, but in fact, there are no Arab nations involved in this invasion. This invasion occurs in the mountains of Israel. That in and of itself requires the pre-existence of a nation of Israel and also control over that particular region of the land. So those two things came about in 1948 with the creation of Israel and the Six-Day War in 1967. So those, both the pre-existence of Israel and the control over these mountains of Israel are in place today. So we see that actually some of the requirements or the requirements for Israel today for this invasion to occur match the definition or the state of Israel today. Things like the fact that they've been brought back from the sword, they've been gathered from many nations and peoples back into the land. So the nation of Israel, as we see it today, fits the requirements for this invasion to occur. As far as the reason for this invasion, we see from scripture that it is for spoils. What that specifically means, we don't know. There's been a lot of speculation that could mean, gas and oil deposits, or even the mineral wealth in the Dead Sea, which is said to have quite a lot of different types of minerals ready to be harvested or gathered. So those are a couple of possibilities. The invasion itself is going to be stopped by God, but he will do so by means of some sort of natural events like earthquakes or floods that will bring that to an end. And as we just said, this destruction is going to take place in the mountains of Israel. So the results of that is a large number of weapons and military equipment that's left behind by the invaders, as well as obviously the bodies of the invaders themselves. So that results in the requirement of two things, which scripture refers to. One is requiring 7 months to bury and deal with all of these dead bodies. And in fact, that includes building a city which will overlook this new cemetery. So that there's a requirement for 7 days of burying. there's also a reference to 7 years of burning in which Israel will use all of this equipment and actually will burn it as a fuel source or some, energy, as a resource, not burning just for the sake of removing it, but actually making practical use for it. So when we get into the next section, bear in mind these 7 months and 7 years. They play key parts in the objections to a lot of the alternative views regarding the timing of this invasion, which is what we talked about in our last session, the timing of this particular invasion. So in the eschatological timeline, we have several key events that are going to occur. We are currently in the church age. Ahead in the timeline is the 7-year Great Tribulation, which is marked by 3 separate events. At the beginning is the signing of a covenant, a 7-year covenant between the Antichrist and the nation of Israel. In the middle of the tribulation, Scripture refers to the Antichrist setting up the abomination of desolation in the temple. And then at the end of the tribulation is when we see Christ's return. Immediately after the 7 years of the tribulation, there is a brief period, an interval, 75-day interval, where there's some other activities that will take place in preparation for the millennial kingdom, a 1,000-year reign where Christ rules on the earth. At the end of that 1,000 years, Scripture talks about a short-lived rebellion against God and against Jesus by some of the peoples who were alive at that particular time. That in and of itself is brought to an end quickly and leads into the next stage, which we call the eternal order, a new creation, a new earth, new heavens, new Jerusalem coming down. And the eternal order is, as the name implies, for the rest of eternity. There's no end to that period. So those are kind of the key milestones or markers that we can measure where we are in this timeline when we're talking about the different views that are held in terms of the timing of the Magog invasion. So we'll first talk about the views which Dr. Fruchtenbaum disagrees with. So as we go through each one, we'll talk about what the proponents of the view state, and then also about what objections that Dr. Fruchtenbaum raises against about that view. So the first one we can call the mid-tribulation view. This is viewed as beginning at the point in the middle of the tribulation when the Antichrist sets up the abomination of desolation. So people who are for this view will say that it makes sense to place it here because Israel is dwelling securely in the land, which is one of the requirements for this invasion, the timing of this invasion. And they say that Israel is dwelling securely because they are living in this period of time after they have signed this covenant with the Antichrist, in which he guarantees this 7 years of peace and security. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum points out several issues with this particular view, and the first one is that dwelling securely doesn't necessarily mean living in peace. It really could mean just living in a state of confidence, which we can say that is true of Israel today, living in confidence of their own military strength and resources to be able to defend themselves. The other question that's raised here is, why would God intervene at this point, but still allow the events of the second half of the tribulation? So in fact, with this abomination of desolation of the temple, Israel begins a period of severe persecution and trial, which ultimately leads up to the campaign of Armageddon at the end of that 3.5-year stretch. The proponents of this view also say that the invasion is the same as referred to in Daniel 11, verse 40, where it talks about the king of the north. So they would attribute the king of the north in Daniel being the same one as Gog or Magog. But in fact, Dr. Fruchtenbaum says that in Daniel, the reference to the king of the north actually is a reference to the king of Syria instead. Another issue is that the 7 months of burying that are required to deal with all of these dead bodies really becomes even more challenging because, as we just said, the state of Israel people are in flight at this point because of the events that have just occurred in the middle of the tribulation. And then the last objection is that the 7 years of burning have to take place while they are in flight. Plus, it extends into the first part of the millennial kingdom. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum believes that the millennial kingdom is supposed to begin in a cleansed earth. So the fact that there is this burying and burning going on at that first part of the kingdom invalidates some of these views, is because it violates this requirement of having a cleansed earth. The next view we can talk about is called the post-tribulation or the Armageddon view. So this view says that the events described in Ezekiel 38 and 39 are the same events as the campaign of Armageddon, which is that campaign which ends the tribulation itself. Issues with this particular view is that in the Ezekiel passages talking about Gog, Magog, we see that there are a limited number of nations involved, whereas in the campaign of Armageddon, it's actually nations from all over the world involved, and they're coming against Jerusalem. So with Ezekiel, we have it coming from the north, whereas in the campaign of Armageddon, it's from the whole earth. The Ezekiel invasion is for the sake of the spoils, as we discussed earlier, whereas the campaign of Armageddon sole purpose is the destruction of the Jews. The destruction of the invaders in Ezekiel is done with convulsions of nature, whereas in the campaign of Armageddon, the attackers are dealt with by the second coming of Jesus. The invaders in the Gog-Magog invasion are destroyed in the mountains of Israel. In comparison to with the campaign of Armageddon, they are killed actually in the valley between Petra and Jerusalem. With the campaign of Armageddon, we have Jews in flight and in hiding, as opposed to with the Ezekiel passages dwelling securely. And then again, the last couple of objections is that this too has an issue with these 7 months of burying and the 7 years of burning, extending well into the millennial kingdom. The third alternate view, which Dr. Fruchtenbaum talks about, he calls the interlude view. So this view in itself begins slightly later than the one we just talked about, in that it begins after the second coming of Christ in this 75-day interval, this short period that occurs after the tribulation but before the millennial kingdom begins. So there is this period of time between, we just said, between the tribulation and the millennium, but it's not long enough to accommodate these 7 months and 7 years. It would need to be at least that long in order for that to work. And this, again, like the other ones, extends this burning and burying well into the millennium. Another view that Dr. Fruchtenbaum talks about is the end of the millennium view. So this begins or views the Gog-Magog invasion being the same as this rebellion, which Scripture talks about occurring at the end of the millennial kingdom, when Satan is released after being in bondage for 1,000 years. So similarly to one of the other views we looked at, this invasion is coming from all over the world, which doesn't really match up with the Ezekiel invasion being from the north. And again, this issue with the 7 months and the 7 years extending well into the eternal state, which again, really, in my view, and I guess in Dr. Fruchtenbaum's view as well, obviously, does not make sense. The eternal state is one that's going to be a newly renovated, or sorry, I should not say renovated, a new earth and a new heavens, completely new. Those types of events don't make sense to occur in that timeline. The view of this timing, which Dr. Fruchtenbaum holds to, he calls the Pretribulational View, which means that this Gog-Magog invasion will occur before the beginning of the tribulation, before the signing of the 7-year covenant with the Antichrist and Israel. And the 7 years and 7 months will have time to be completely resolved or come to an end before we reach the middle of the tribulation. So this could occur at any time between now and 3.5 years before the signing of the covenant, in order for that all to be finished, so that when we talk about Israel living securely in the land, that truth, or that state, is the state of being for the nation, is true up until that point. So it's before the tribulation begins, Israel is established and dwelling securely. This invasion occurs during that time when they are living in a time of security, and it's destroyed before the tribulation. The description of Israel matches the existence of the nation today. Russia, as identified as being Magog, is still a world power today. And as we just mentioned, it's, in his opinion, the one that deals best with this issue of the 7 months and 7 years. Now, one additional view that Dr. Fruchtenbaum does not refer to, but in fact comes from Andy Woods and Sugarland Bible Church. So he has a slightly different view on Ezekiel 38 and 39. So Dr. Fruchtenbaum believes that chapters 38 and 39 are describing the same events. And he views 39 as being an example of what he calls the law of recurrence. So this is one of his laws of interpretation. And what the law of recurrence says is that a passage of scripture will describe some events, and then another passage will describe the same events but give more detail. So one example of the law of recurrence is the Genesis account, Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 talks about creation at a high level. You know, the 7 days of creation, we have day 6, the creation of animals and mankind. So then Genesis chapter 2 really drills down into the events of day 6 specifically, then we get into Adam and Eve. Some people would interpret that as being 2 different creations, but in fact, it is following this law of recurrence, a passage detailing the same events, but with more detail. So Dr. Fruchtenbaum says 39 is really chapter 39 of Ezekiel. It's the same events as described in chapter 38, just with more detail. Andy Woods, in contrast, believes that 38 and 39 are really bookends to the invasion events. 38 marks the beginning of the invasion, which he says will occur in the beginning of the tribulation after the second seal judgment. And chapter 39 gives the events around the end of this Gog-Magog invasion, which he places at near the end of the tribulation and the second coming of Jesus. This view has issues with this 7 months and 7 years as well, because that timeline would extend slightly into the millennial kingdom. Again, in contrast to Dr. Fruchtenbaum saying that that cannot be, because his view is that the millennium begins with a cleansed earth. Andy Woods actually holds the view that there are other things that are burning during the millennial kingdom. So why is this burning of the military equipment such a big deal? He doesn't see that as being an issue for his perspective on this timeline. So those are 6 different views regarding the timeline of the Gog-Magog invasion as described by Ezekiel in chapters 38 and 39. And next week we get into the rest of the birth pangs, like the one world government, the 10 kingdom stage, and so on. So we will get into those next week as we continue our study. God bless you.